interview is quite special tonight, Leith, because a little while ago I made an impromptu trip from Western Australia over to Melbourne because, along with Michael Gray-Griffith from Cafe Lockdown, we had a 24-hour epic podcast, and we had guests across the gamut. It was politicians, activists, all sorts of people within Australia, international, Senator Malcolm Roberts. We had so many different people. Senator Malcolm Roberts was our very first guest, along with Nicola Charles, the White Rabbit. And just when the discussion started getting really interesting, because Nicola was talking about how Australia is a corporation, and Senator Malcolm Roberts had a different opinion, if you like. And unfortunately, because we had a very tight schedule on the 24-hour Epic podcast, we had to move on to our next guest. So, of course, I got a whole flurry of phone calls and messages from people wanting to continue that conversation, with Malcolm or with the White Rabbit. And your name was brought up a few times, and we managed to get in touch. And here we are this evening. And the title of the show is Law of Laws, Lore of Laws, LAW. I've been to one of the grand juries. I've been to a couple of sheriff meetings. I've watched videos, so on and so forth. But it's not a topic that I'm really on top of. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here tonight, because from the Epic podcast, people want to hear about this, and also for myself, because, as I said, I'm really not on top of all of this stuff. So all of that to say, it's great to have you here tonight, Lee.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
100%. Yeah. So in the description, we've got a few things that we wanted to talk about tonight. And if people have questions, you can ask them in the comments. And Leith said she's more than happy to answer questions, because I have a feeling this is going to be one of those nights where everybody's got questions. But the first thing perhaps we can start to talk about is moving the debtor to the creditor. So let's get there. Is there anything you want to preface what we say or introduce what we're about to talk about before we get to that, Leith?
Yeah, for sure. So probably the best place to start is to recognize that humanity is inside a highly structured framework. And we like to go back to, because it's really a very important starting position, 1302, which is the master trust that humanity got put into. So it all stems from there, really, as to how we became the debtor, when in actual fact we are the creditor. Because if you tune into your divine self, you know that you have inherent right to resources living on your own planet. You should not be paying for all the things that you're paying for. So really the master trust of Unum Sanctum came from the Vatican. So it's a Vatican instrument, and it spun off from the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta of 1215, which is all are equal before the law. So that's specifically what the Magna Carta was defining, that the nobility could not have a second set of rules for itself, otherwise we would be in slavery. And so King John signed off at that at 1215, in the year 1215. And then in 1297, it had further developments. And then just 5 years later, the Vatican popped all of humanity and all of planet Earth into Unum Sanctum of 1302. So that put humanity into a position called guardianship, which is so critically important to understand, because when humanity is under guardianship, it doesn't have to be consulted on anything. And so that then allowed the corporate structure, which the Vatican is a corporate structure. It's a privately owned corporate structure. And even though it's all collapsing now, we have to go back and look at what are we emerging out of and what are we emerging into. So this is this pivotal time on the planet of the changing of the ages, the end of Pisces and the beginning of Aquarius. So in the age of Pisces, we've been under this guardianship, which means we've basically had our rights removed. We've been deemed incompetent. And sure enough, all of this corporate structure has built these really intricate systems around us and not bothered to teach them. So in school, you didn't learn about, the current sort of structures of the UCC or, the Constitution, which is just a document that's been born out of the doctrine of discovery and other papal bulls, etc. So you've only been taught a very small amount of content that allowed you to exist within the realm of being the debtor. So being under guardianship is a nice name for slavery, basically. Someone's removed your inherent right to resources and you don't have to be consulted on things. And then along the way, the birth certificate, which really only came into play in 1837. Prior to that, it was the settlement certificate. And so you had to, firstly, the people were given to the church to be looked after. They were deemed to be church property, and that's really still the case to this day, except for the unspent potential of humanity to wake up its consciousness and realise that all of this is fiction and start flipping the trust and getting ourselves back into the position of the creditor, which is something that we work extensively on. So in Parliament is only writing for the debtor. So everything written through Parliament positions us to be the debtor. All of the systems are written for us to be the debtor and the customer. So like if you were to look at your electric bill, at section 1B, it's going to tell you that you're the customer, but you're not the customer, you're the custodian. And so this is, has a pivotal effect upon how the planet is functioning. And so because we're in this changing of the ages and at the end of a series of systems, including the breakdown of the Rothschilds banking system, which has run for 111 years since 1913, we're in this optimum position to be flipping everything. And of course, the Rothschilds banking system wrote the document called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars that was found in a photocopier in the 60s. So it actually says what they're going to do if they were to implode, which of course they have imploded because it's an imploding equation and it's a privately owned. The US dollar was a privately owned currency that snuck into power on the 23rd of December in 1913. So in that document, it says if they're going to get taken out, they're going to do a genocide event, which was COVID. They would do inflation, which we've got through the roof. And we've also had a major swarm of immigration, which has caused all kinds of social problems, as well as you can now witness there's a flurry of big towers that they want to build. So they're really herding humanity into this environment where they want humanity to go up instead of out when we've got an abundance of land. And those towers are built in places where all the money would flow into the biggies, like, the Coles and Woolworths and Kmart and Big W and all that type of things.
Just a quick question there. I've already got a question. You were talking about, the 1913, the Rothschilds bank system, and if they were going to be taken out, they would do a genocide event, and we can assert that is was the COVID war. What would have alerted them to the fact that they were going to not succeed in their awful plans? What would it have been? Because it would have been obviously before the COVID war, and they had to figure that out. What would have alerted them to that?
Well, this has been a long process to take them out. As soon as the US dollar was installed, it was pretty much known that, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster. So it was JFK that tried to take them out. There's that assassination. They did 9/11. That was an event to take them out as well. And that's when Q really began. And then when they did 9/11, it was determined that they would have to be taken out in a much different way, or they would do another event like that. And so that's actually what was scheduled when Trump won his second round as president. They said, if you don't let Biden come in, we're going to do another 9/11. So it's been a long journey of getting rid of it. And of course, it owns absolutely everything. It is, we've got the foundation stone of BlackRock, and then it goes to Vanguard and onward from there. And if you look at any corporation and Google who are the top 5 investors in this mega corporation, whatever it might be, you will find that it's Vanguard and BlackRock for sure. It's and a monopoly business model is a strictly forbidden business model because it upsets the very important mechanism of supply and demand. You don't have any options with a monopoly, so we never actually really get to learn what humanity wants because it's only ever been given one choice. It might divide itself up into different outlets and look like, we've got 4 different banks. Who do we want to choose from? But no, they're all just one bank, right? There's only ever been that real one bank.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the law of laws, the law, L-O-R-E, which is the livingness that comes through the First Nation people, and we're all First Nation, we've all come from somewhere. They've got a very long history of moving humanity around the planet. We've just had this huge influx of, immigrants from all around the planet. There's people moving because they keep moving everyone. So it is the living. We all have the same rights, inherent rights to be on the planet. And then laws, L-A-W-S, is land, air, water, spirit. So it's the law, the living, looking after the land, air, water, spirit, of which we all are. Because, of course, Mother Earth is a living being in her own right, and she has needs, and the waters have needs, and the crops and the trees and all of that. So by having humanity tend to nature, we stay in balance with it, which is why if you look at the original map of Terra Australis, before the framework of the Commonwealth system, which has also been violated, laid itself over the top of, you can see that it's, so many tiny little tribes all looking after specific areas, because then they live and breathe and know this land and this landscape and the seasons and the cycles. So we're actually really tending to Mother Earth.
Yeah.
And so then in comes this legal system. So when we have this legal system, which is what is managing the guardianship that we're all inside of, that calls itself law, you got to remember that if it's prepared to do a genocide event, which it has and does often, there's no bounds to how much this system will lie. So a legal system is a subset of law, and we call it a subset because it violates the free will and informed consent of humanity, meaning it can go along and do whatever it wants and position us however it wants, because we're under this guardianship. So again, you can see the power of the guardianship, or we don't have to consult them. And so you want to be mindful that the birth certificate as an instrument, we call it an instrument, is actually a receipt for the corporation to have use of the resources and to build things that the corporation wants without having to consult you, because you're under guardianship and you're classified as incompetent, and you're made to be incompetent because you're not taught anything in school. 12 years in school, you never learned anything about law. That was when we had COVID come through. Nobody knew how to protect themselves. They had no working knowledge or dialogue around law.
Yes.
So humanity is managed by maxim of law. So maxim of law is timeless energetic fields of a yin and yang, negative, positive polarity, right? Because everything in this dimension is a polar reality. The third dimension is a polar reality. So if you do something like all are accountable for their actions, then when you violate that, we have something like COVID unfold, where the corporation has stepped in and said, you have to tell the people below you that if they don't get the jab, they're going to lose their job and so forth. And it trickled down through the corporate infrastructure and threatened everybody. But if humanity was in the right position and was actually functioning in law, enough people would have been able to say, and let's hope we're at that position now if they ever tried to do it again, enough people would go, oh, no. All are equal before the law. That's a maxim of law. All are accountable for their actions. That's a maxim of law. And so then when we write the grand juries, so we've done 38 grand juries now. We started on the equinox of 2021, and we write a grand jury every full moon. So we've written over 650 orders now. We write for us being the creditor, whereas Parliament just writes for us being the debtor. So we write a very hefty list now of very serious and expensive fines for those that move against maxims of law. If they say, oh no, we can do this to you and we can do that to you, we can issue fines to you, we can cut your electricity off. For cutting off electricity, it used to be a $100,000 penalty notice from the grand jury, but in the grand jury that we just did this month, on the 18th, the grand jury decided to put those fines up to $250,000 if you cut someone off from essential right to resources, because you have inherent right to essential resources. You are water, 80% water. The planet's 80% water. So who are you paying for water? And the birth certificate is the tool that has been monetized onto the Securities and Exchange Commission that generates all the revenue, all the currency, remembering that all forms of money are just fiction. And so we've already paid for all the infrastructure that delivers the water, that delivers the electricity.
I know one question comes up, and I know a few people have asked this, myself included, because we see a lot of, when I say we, I mean people that engage in social media, particularly over the past 4 years. When people want to talk about birth certificates, so on and so forth, can we see where that's being monetized? Are we able to see that? Because as of yet, I know that keeps coming up with people. With how do we find that? How do we find that out about ourselves?
Well, it's monetized. Yeah, you can. You can look at the UCC. I mean, it goes through the Uniform Commercial Code because there's only one government. There's not like a government of Australia. Yeah, there's only one global government, and that started at the end of World War II, which ended in September of 1945. The United Nations began in October of 1945. So we've got to question that, right? Of course. And at the end of the Second World War was Operation Paperclip, which dispersed all of the pharmaceutical, which now gave us the COVID. And so you have to say, well, why didn't Australia have a referendum before it became a founding signatory to the United Nations? Well, it didn't, because Australia is a fictional commercial framework that's a global arm that sits over the top of Australia, and it deals with the public and the person, which then it fails to speak of joinder. So people think, oh, I'm the public. We're always processed as the Public Health Act. But we're not the public and we're not the person. So how they manage all of that with the birth certificate and monetizing it is through the Uniform Commercial Code, right? So the UCC. And that's how you can declare that you're the creditor, not to say that it's necessarily acknowledged when you do that through UCC 1. Your birth certificate number, is a QSIP number, as Rex is putting up there. So all of the instruments that we use to move around in society, Medicare cards, driver's licenses, car registrations, bank loans, everything is monetized and securitized. Mortgages, mortgages go into a tranche and then are floated on the stock market, and only for institutional investors, because it's a really safe investment because people are generally going to pay their mortgage or they're going to lose their house. Mm-hmm. So the big institutions come in and they generate the superannuation and insurance and all that sort of thing. So it's really just feeding itself. We're paying for our own prison. And of course, something like a mortgage is everything is a promissory note, especially when there's money changing hands. It's all a promissory note. So there's going to be no other signature on the mortgage. A mortgage fails all 8 essentials of a valid contract, meaning there's no transparency, there's no meeting of the minds, there's no valid consideration, meaning the bank didn't give you something and then you go and work for 30 years to pay it back. They didn't give you anything. You signed a promissory note and then you go and work for 30 years and pay back these fictional digits in a computer. And so that is the whole system is a fraud, a total fraud. And then it calls itself law. So people are constantly arguing with this system and expecting to get law out of it and going to the courts and thinking that the courts are courts of law. But they're not courts of law. They're just courts of banking. It's just all commerce. So essentially, humanity is run by a giant commercial corporate machine. And so we call that the dead, right? Because corporations is classified as the dead. It has no breath in it. We can divide between the breath and the no breath. And so we say breath is superior jurisdiction and no breath is inferior jurisdiction. So it's superior jurisdiction, the living. We don't argue with inferior jurisdiction. We just give it instructions that it has to follow. There's no point arguing, right? So humanity's been trained to be in controversy, to be in battle, all that type of stuff. And so that is a distraction away from being able to recognize the true framework that we're sitting in, where the creditor would show up, which we call the executor and beneficiary in the commercial world. And you come in and manage your estate, your inherent right to your estate, which everybody has. And because you went under guardianship, the state is managing your estate, right? And you're under guardianship and you don't know that and you haven't been trained, you haven't been told any of that type of stuff. And then you go out and spend your life working to live. And now the more things that we allegedly need, like 20 odd years ago, there wasn't mobile phones, there wasn't internet, there wasn't $60,000, $70,000 cars. So now everyone's working at horrendous hours per day. The kids are farmed off in every direction. You know, you've got daycare, preschool, primary school, there's a kindy in there, high school. So there's this separation of the family unit, separation away from the mother role, the feminine role, and then the disorientation of the male role that's around that. So we're just totally farmed in every way. We are farmed, and that's what Big Pharma is. We are in the farm. We are the cattle in the farm. And if you were to go to, it's the merchant lords, the pirates on the high seas of the Holy See, right? We're in the Holy See. So in that macabre story that the Vatican spun was that we're all lost at sea, and, you know, then you get docked and birthed and barcoded and you're chattel slave from that point forward. You can go forward at any time and say, I've woken up and I'm claiming my estate. But because the corporate machine now is so big and cumbersome and humanity has been terribly dumbed down, terribly trapped, a lot of people would not move against the state because they've got a mortgage and they need food in their fridge and they've got kids and maybe one person is awake and the other partner is not, and that explodes relationships really quickly. And if one individual wakes up in a family unit and the other ones have not woken up, that's a recipe for a disaster in that family unit.
Yeah.
I'm not a slave. I'm not going to put up with that. I'm not going to be enclosed in that system. And so when I talk about enclosure, all the instruments that they use are forms of enclosure, because in that unum sanctum trust that everything went into, in order for you to get to your resources, you have to use an instrument to get them. They've basically put all the resources behind the instrument. Then when you use the instrument, like a birth certificate or a driver's license, you shed your sovereignty through not I don't want to say ignorance, it is ignorance, but it's willful ignorance that they have derived. They've purposefully not told the structure. So when you use their instrument, you suddenly are beholden to the statute and legislation that is attached to that instrument, which is to say you've got to pull over for an RBT, or we're the cops at the side of the road, we're going to tell you to get out of the car and you better get out of it, or we're going to yank you out. We become beholden to this legal system that calls itself law, but it's not law, it's a legal system. And, we've lost our sovereignty. But in any moment, you can claim your sovereignty back. And we do that by taking the position of the executor and beneficiary. And then what happens to the board of the guardians, this is critically important to recognise. When you become the executor and beneficiary, so you move out of being the chattel slave, the board of the guardians have to become the trustees. That is how we flip the trust. So then one of the key board of the guardians is, of course, the judiciary, right? So when you go to a magistrate's court, which is a summary judgment court, you cannot be seen and you cannot be heard. You are totally processed as a chattel slave. That's why writing an affidavit before you ever go to a court is critically important, because the chances of your word being heard inside a court when you're being processed as a chattel slave is extremely remote. Whereas if you've got an affidavit filed, you can say, excuse me, magistrate, point 10 on my affidavit, I've said the following. So, it's a whole game of commerce and a whole game of trickery.
There's a sign on the highway, there's a fork in the road, a lifetime of lessons learned, don't mean nothing, it shows. Armchair doctor, experts making all the rules, selling us their theories while they take us all for fools. And there's nowhere left to hide on that freedom road. Don't tell me what to think, don't tell me how to live on that freedom road. Get your hand out of my pocket, I got no more to give, I got no more to give. There's a cop in the distance behind a big box tree. There's a crime being committed somewhere, but the radar gun's on me. A quiet quarter afternoon, I'm doing 105, like a fat kid on a seesaw, all tilted to one side. And there's nowhere left to hide, and no one's putting up a fight on that freedom road. Don't tell me what to think, don't tell me how to live on that freedom road. Get your hand out of my pocket, I got no more to give, I got no more to give. freedom road. Don't tell me what to think. Don't tell me how to live on that freedom road. Get your hand out of my pocket. I got no more to give on that freedom road. Don't tell me what to think. Don't tell me how to live